Hello, welcome to another episode of In the Trenches with Gang Green. I'm your host, Bubbs. Today is Wednesday, January 15th. Hopefully, everybody's having a good day so far today. This is episode 471 of the In the Trenches with Gang Green podcast. I thank you, as always, for joining me. And we've got some more New York Jets head coach and general manager search news to discuss today. A little bit more on Aaron Glenn, and the New York Jets have officially wrapped up their first round of general manager interviews. The second round, now in-person interviews, are expected to begin late this week into the weekend, and ideally, you find your finalist, find your guy by early to mid next week, where you can then begin your second round of head coach interviews with your general manager already in place. So a long process. We have finished first round of interviews, still got a long way to go, both head coach and general manager perspective, but at least making a little bit of a ground here as we reach the week and a half point of the 2025 off season and this search as a whole. As always, before we begin on today's podcast, we got to tell you about our podcast partners, starting with our friends over at BetUS, America's favorite online sportsbook. If you want to get in on any of the sports betting action, check out BetUS and use my link in the description of this video to get a 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits up to $2,000. Divisional round this weekend, my favorite weekend of football all year. Games are typically a lot better, and you still get 2 games on Saturday and 2 games on Sunday. So lots of football, good competitive football, big weekend before championship weekend coming up next weekend. So you want to get in on any of the action, check out BetUS, America's favorite online sportsbook. Also, our friends over at SeatGeek. If you're looking to get a ticket in sports or the best in entertainment, use promo code BUBSONSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. And also our friends over at Huga House. You see me wearing my Huga House hats all the time on this podcast. Not only do they have hats, but January 17th, they are releasing in just 2 days sweatshirts. So if you want to get your hands on any of their awesome hats or their new sweatshirts that are coming right around the corner, check them out. And at checkout, use promo code BUBS for 15% off your purchase. And when you use that promo code, you'll get 30% off your next purchase. So check them out and get yourself some awesome Huga House swag. So here we go, episode 471. Thank you so much for tuning in. For those joining us on YouTube, make sure to please like and subscribe. We continue to get closer to 500 subscribers. Appreciate all those tuning in on all the different audio podcast platforms as well. So we got some more news to talk about from the New York Jets head coach and general manager search. We'll start with the Aaron Glenn side of things today. We've talked a lot of Aaron Glenn. We've talked a lot of Brian Flores. So I'll try and keep this a little short and sweet before we get to the general manager stuff, which is more new stuff, and want to talk a little bit more about some of these candidates and where the Jets go from here as they enter the second round of interviews with ultimately their finalists here, in-person interviews, ideally finding a guy by middle of next week or early next week where they can then start their head coach in-person interviews with that GM in place. Aaron Glenn today, there was a report that came out from the New York Post that said it feels like the Jets are his preferred destination. So I'll throw it up here on the screen for the YouTube viewers. And we've kind of known this a little bit about Aaron Glenn. And he's been labeled as a favorite a lot. He's been labeled with the Saints. He's been labeled with the Jets. It feels like those are the two teams vying for him. But this report here, per Justin Tash of the New York Post, team reporter Brian Costello wrote in his Inside the Jets newsletter that Detroit Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn has, quote, told people the Jets are his first choice if he were to be offered a head coaching position. Now, these are all rumors, all speculation, of course. That's not Aaron Glenn directly telling Brian Costello, directly telling the New York Post. That's him telling his circle, telling people around him who obviously have let it out, have given out the sources. Costello got his source, and those are the rumors. So it's all rumors. It's all speculation. It's all reported. But I don't think this should come by much of a surprise with Aaron Glenn, right? We've talked about him a ton on this podcast. We've talked about Brian Flores a ton on this podcast. It feels like the two front runners, the two favorites, which we talked about yesterday, are Brian Flores and Aaron Glenn. And specifically Aaron Glenn, it feels like it's a two-man race. And the news that comes out here today from the New York Post reportedly saying he wants this job, we've kind of known this now for a little while, but it does reaffirm that because New Orleans is also a strong candidate for him because you look at the Saints and his connections there. He was a player in 2008. He coached there as the defensive backs coach from 2016 to 2020. So he spent 5 seasons as a coach and 1 season as a player. So 6 total seasons there within the organization. And they are a team, of course, looking for a head coach, potentially a defensive mind like Aaron Glenn. I still feel, though, with these reports and everything else we've heard, I still feel if the New York Jets would to offer and make the decision to go and get Aaron Glenn, he would be the guy. He would take this offer. He would take this job in a minute. He has said it a couple years ago. This would be his dream job. You know he's ready. Him and Ben Johnson both will get coaching opportunities this cycle. I both expect those guys to become head coaches. I know there's some people that say, oh, well, maybe they both return. I don't foresee that happening. I think both of them are ready. Both of them will get opportunities. It's just a matter of where. But if the Jets really want Aaron Glenn, and this process starts to speed up here a little bit, obviously the Lions, them in the playoffs does impact it a little bit where you're not going to be able to hire him until the season's officially over, which with the way the Lions are playing as a 1 seed, they could potentially go all the way. So you could be waiting until a while until you officially get Glenn as a head coach. But if the Jets want Glenn, all signs are pointing towards if he's really their top guy and they want him, he's going to come here because he wants this job. I also wanted to play this clip on Aaron Glenn because it is causing quite the discussions around the Jet world. A lot of Jet fans continue to get hyped up for the possibility of Aaron Glenn. You guys know where I stand. Flores is my 1. Glenn's my 2. If you can't get either of those guys, then it gets interesting. I'm not really high on crazy high on anybody else. Maybe you could take a risk at a Joe Brady, which I've talked about. I don't love Arthur Smith. I would hate that if you're the Jets. Don't love the idea of a Matt Nagy. I don't love like a Vance Joseph or Ron Rivera, those guys. I think if you miss out on Flores or Glenn, I think you're better off maybe taking a risk at maybe a Joe Brady or somebody like that. But we'll find out. We'll talk about that. We'll cross that bridge if we ever get there. But here is Aaron Glenn today talking about his mindset as a coach, not really being a defensive guy, being just a coach that can do everything.
As far as, typically, Bill Belichick is a shining example of a defensive coach who won Super Bowls, but typically it's offensive coordinators. They come from the offense who become Super Bowl head-winning coaches.
Yeah.
Why do you think that might be?
Well, I don't know if that's truly accurate. I can just go off the top of my head with Bill Carr, Mike Tomlin, Bill Belichick. That's won a ton of Super Bowls as a defensive coach. And here's the one thing that I would say about myself. I'm a coach. I just happen to be on defense. I understand the offense just as well as a number of people. So if you're going to hire me, you're going to hire a coach. You're not going to hire a defensive coach. I'm going to talk to the offense just as much as I'm going to talk to the defense.
So there's Glenn kind of describing that CEO mentality of being not just an offensive coach or defensive coach, but also being an offensive coach, a guy that can see both sides of the ball, a guy that can talk to both sides of the ball and oversee both sides of the ball. Look, we have to see with Glenn. I look, again, Flores, Glenn, those are my top 2. A lot of the things you say about Glenn, a lot of what we said about Saleh. Now, they are different backgrounds. Glenn has the playing background. He does have a lot more, feels like stronger connections, and it feels like a lot more excitement around him than maybe Saleh did. Although Saleh had a ton of excitement around him, but just in terms of NFL connections, right? Glenn has the connection with Parcells. Sean Payne spoke very highly of him. You've got, Bill Cowher. He spoke very highly of him. There's a connection there. So Glenn does have connections and has gotten rave reviews for some really, really great NFL coaches who have been around for a while and have had a lot of success. You just have to see it to believe it. That's really kind of where you're at, where he's a first-time guy, CEO guy. He gives off the vibes that he can be that guy, but will he actually do that? And that's the big question. And you will find that out eventually. That's really what it's going to come down to, is you will find out whether or not he's that guy pretty early on. But all signs point towards him ideally taking what he learned as a player, seeing this organization turn around, having that connection with Parcells. They still talk often to this day. They still talk a lot. Ideally, he's got a lot of great resources around him. You maybe bring in a veteran coaching staff, veteran GM, and you pair him with Glenn, where he can kind of have those veterans around him help him through this process. He has also just seen a first-time head coach in Dan Campbell turn around an organization that was in a similar situation as the Jets are in right now, where nobody wanted anything to do with Detroit. They were a dumpster fire. They were a disaster. I talked about it yesterday. They wanted to take them off of Thanksgiving. That's how bad it got. And they were able to turn it around. So ideally, he took those experiences and could implement that here with the Jets. But the biggest thing is just a first-time guy. It's an unknown. He would be my number 2. So that's the Aaron Glenn stuff. Again, I think the main takeaway is if the Jets want him, he's going to come here. I think the Jets are higher on his list. The Jets are number 1 on his list over New Orleans. If it's not the Jets, then it's probably going to be the Saints for Glenn, one of those 2 teams. Now, moving on to the Jets GM search. Yesterday, they wrapped up their search officially. Final first-round interview was with Brian Gaine, who I actually like. So I wouldn't consider it. I would consider it a last, but certainly not least first-round interview, because I do enjoy, or I do like, and I do feel like Brian Gaine could be an underrated candidate. I actually put him on my GM tier list that I did last week under my intrigued category. A guy that's got some Jets connections, got some Bill Parcells connections. He also has been a GM before, so he's got some experience. So I do potentially like Brian Gaine as an option. Now, the Jets interviewed 15 candidates for their general manager search. They will now begin their second round of that process, probably later this week, maybe later this week into the weekend and into next week, where ideally you find your candidate sometime next week and you can kind of begin the process, because the Jets still have, I believe, they interviewed Vance Joseph today, so they've still got 7 head coach candidates that they've got to get through, which probably won't happen until maybe next week. They'll probably finish up first round. That's 31 interviews overall in the first round, not counting second round. So they'll start to be in person. From what you hear, from what you see, if I had to guess the Jets' top candidates for the general manager search right now, I think Mike Borgonzi's very high on their list. I think if you would tell me right now to predict who's the Jets general manager, I would probably say it's either a Mike Borgonzi, or I do think, and I don't want this to be the case, I do think Ryan Grigson, just with the Flores connection, could potentially be high on their list. Now, I know you hear some other reports that that's not necessarily true, or you do hear some reports that it's Grigson more so wanting to be with Flores, not so much anybody else wanting that to be a package. So you've heard some conflicting reports, but there obviously still is some level of interest on some level with Ryan Grigson, which I would stay away from. I think that is, I know he's got experience, but to me, what he did in Indy is just really, really concerning. And I think there's so many better candidates out there, especially when you look at candidates that have been in the position before. To me, if you're going to hire a guy that's been in the position before, it's Thomas Dimitroff, and he's still my top guy. But if I had to guess the Jets' top candidates, I would say Borgonzi's up there. I would say there's definitely a level of interest in Grigson. I would definitely say Chris Spielman's up there. And I would certainly be on board with a potential Spielman-Aaron Glenn combo. They're both in Detroit, both first-time guys. But it feels like Spielman maybe in a way could kind of be that football operations guy that oversees everything, kind of what he's doing now in Detroit. A big, really led the Lions process of getting Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell in that building, got those guys hired. So maybe you go with a Spielman as kind of the pro football football operations guy, and then you go with another GM, or Spielman as some sort of assistant that kind of oversees everything, that he reports back to the owner. However, maybe they view that. I wouldn't be surprised if Spielman ends up on this staff in some way, shape, or form. I also think Mike Greenberg, and this is just me speculating off of what you've seen. I would also consider Greenberg as one of the favorites. I would also consider Alec Hallaby pretty high on their list. I don't see a John Robinson very high. I don't think Jim Nagy's happening. I don't think Louis Riddick's happening. I don't think a Ray Farmer's happening. Trey Brown, Lance Newmark, don't see those happening. Maybe Brian Gain, but I don't know. I think those other guys are probably up there more so. In terms of my top candidates, and I've said this a lot, to me, Thomas Dimitrov is my number one. Now, the reason I don't necessarily know if it's so much the Jets, and I know they wanted to go through a thorough process, but to me, and maybe this is just me, and maybe it's just the way I'm looking at it, if Thomas Dimitrov really, he was the first interview. He was the first general manager and head coach interview that the New York Jets made. I believe it was week 16, week 17, maybe when they interviewed him. There was still a game or two left in the season when they interviewed Thomas Dimitrov because he wasn't with a team. Their first 4 interviews were Dimitrov, then I believe it went John Robinson, Jim Nagy, and then Louis Riddick, because all 4 of those guys right now are not employed by NFL teams, so they were allowed to interview them. They interviewed those guys before the season finished. Dimitrov was the first one. If Dimitrov really impressed and they really liked him with his background, with his resume, you feel like they would have, maybe not so much he would have already gotten the job, but you feel like you would hear more about him because he was the first interview. If they really liked Dimitrov, you feel like you would hear a lot more. You really haven't heard anything about Dimitrov. You haven't heard any rumors, any talk about him since that interview. And maybe the Jets are just keeping it tight-lipped and that's just how it is. But you're hearing a lot about Borgonzi. You're hearing about the connection between Grigson and Flores, right? Spielman and the connection with Glenn. Also his brother, Rick Spielman, helping Tannenbaum with this search. So you're hearing all that. You haven't heard much about Dimitrov. But to me, Dimitrov's my top guy. Ideally, in a perfect world, if I could get the best GM, in my opinion, it's Dimitrov. My number 2, I do like Borgonzi, even though he's a first-time guy. I would take him over some of these other. I would take him over Grigson. Spielman would be on my list. I do like the potential idea of maybe a Mike Greenberg. I also like Brian Gain a lot. I'm intrigued by him. I think he is kind of an underrated candidate. I don't think many Jet fans are talking about him, but I like the idea of Brian Gain. I'll throw up my list from last week, and this doesn't have all the candidates on it. I'm saying no to Grigson, Ray Farmer. Don't love, Sullivan from the Packers. Don't love Louis Riddick. Don't love Jim Nagy. Nagy maybe in like a scouting role, but GM, no way. My yes is Dimitrov. Like it would be Borgonzi. Intrigued is like Greenberg, Brian Gain. You could throw Spielman on there. When I made this list, Spielman wasn't yet requested, so you could throw Spielman on probably the intrigued list. But then again, like if you're telling me it's Borgonzi and Nagy or Borgonzi and Spagnuolo, I don't know. I don't love either of Spagnuolo or Nagy. If you're telling me to choose from Spielman and Glenn or Borgonzi and Nagy, I'm taking Spielman and Glenn. In a perfect world, you can get like a Dimitrov and a Flores or a Dimitrov and a Glenn. Like a Dimitrov and Glenn, I think has potential because you have a guy in Dimitrov that has been there, done that, built the franchise from the ground up with the Falcons, got them to a Super Bowl, right? Drafted the quarterback in 2008, gave up a haul for Julio Jones, got a gold jacket receiver, got a franchise quarterback right away. And the Falcons were a consistent winning franchise that was in it almost every year up until it was 13 years for Dimitrov. Really successful time in Atlanta. You put him and all that experience with Glenn, I think that could set Glenn up for success. Where you have an experienced guy, a rookie coach, but Dimitrov can kind of lead him through and help him out. So, my top candidate's Dimitrov. If I had to make a prediction on who's the higher, I think Borgonzi or Grigson. If I had to make a prediction. I think either one of those guys I could definitely see happening. I could see Spielman as well. Spielman would be like third. I put him on here as well, just because his connection with Glenn, I think could be intriguing. One name I will say, and I'll close this out afterwards. One name that I haven't heard a ton of, or nobody really has, is Ray Agnew. He felt like he would be one of the hotter names on this market. Maybe he has told people that, no, I'm not interviewing. I'm happy in Detroit. He is a little bit older for a first-time guy, so maybe that's the case. But Ray Agnew would be decently high on my list if they did interview him. I don't foresee that happening. They haven't. Right? They finished their first round of interviews. I don't foresee them now requesting an interview for Ray Agnew. Either maybe we were too high on Ray Agnew, or fans were, or maybe Ray Agnew has let people know I'm fine in Detroit. I'm happy here. Because he did have the connection with the Jets, where his son is a scout with the Jets right now. Maybe that had something to do with it, with the way it ended with Douglas. Maybe he doesn't want to come here for that reason. I don't know. But I have found it kind of shocked that 15 names are in and not one of them's Ray Agnew. But he hasn't got interviewed elsewhere. That's the thing. Like, it would be one thing if Ray Agnew was getting interviewed elsewhere. He hasn't. Of my knowledge, he hasn't. Instead, it's been Spielman. It's kind of like the Ray Agnew from Detroit, right? That's the Detroit GM interview, Spielman instead of Agnew. But that's where I stand there with the general manager. I think your finalist will be, I think Dimitrov is a finalist. I do. I could see that happening. He's my top guy. I think Berganzi will definitely be a finalist. I think Grigson will be a finalist. I think Spielman will be. Greenberg, I think, will be. They'll probably have 5 or 6. I could see Hallaby, maybe Brian Gain. I don't see Trey Brown. Lance Newmark, who they interviewed, I don't know. I don't see that. I don't see Ray Farmer, although I wouldn't. If there was one guy that maybe people are, like, if there was one surprise or one name that I haven't, one like retread that I like, kind of a guy that's maybe under like the average category, would be like Ray Farmer. I don't hate that idea, but I don't see that happening. That's the list. That's the 15 names. They've interviewed all 15. So process continues. Get down to about 5 or 6. Get to the finalists. Hire your GM. Have that GM in the final coaching interviews, in the in-person interviews. Get together, figure out who your head coach is, and go from there. The process is slowly but surely continuing. So let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Are you on board? Dimitrov, your top GM candidate. Where do you stand on Flores? Where do you stand on Glenn? Where do you stand on the rest of the coaching carousel? How many more names are the Jets going to interview, or is this it? 31 names between the general manager and the head coach. So let me know what you think. Make sure to please like and subscribe. We'll talk to you guys soon. As always, JETS, 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 Jets.